Hi everyone. Come back with a little lecture today and talk a little bit more about the project management process groups and the actions. I saw a lot of you were discussing kind of the different levels, so I wanted to bring in some thought process back a little bit about why we do this, because the process itself is, looking for a result from your actions to the series, and it's about the business case. Selecting a project, number one, that your organization needs to do so it has a business effective measure. In the end, they're looking to do a balanced scorecard. A lot of business courses talk with this manner, and it's looking at the service and the innovation to make sure it's operational efficiency and or it's a financial process that actually creates a defined metrics that you can use in your overall organization to benefit or to benefit your clients, more importantly. When you look at the process itself, there's kind of, you know, three or four major pieces that we've been discussing: the initiation fee, or not fee, sorry, initiation or the scope area. And this is where we've talked a lot about that charter, project charter idea, where we're defining everything from the objectives of the actual process to the rules of which each of us will do inside of that project. More importantly, you're defining the authority aspects, which sets up the communication tools. And it's also defining why we're doing this. What is the business needs? Is it just client base? Is this an internal project that's going to speed up performance, allow sales managers to have real-time effective measures, or understanding what we actually have on our shelves across the globe? Think about Best Buy and some of these other businesses that are big box stores today. On the business needs that they have for effective data marts, all across every single individual store that they have a category system. If one of them's going down, they don't know what the flow is, whether or not they need to ship more to this store or to that store. They're always defining in scope, and it's kind of recreating for each area and region across our country. This is looking at the business needs. A lot of times they're looking at projected worth of a project or whether or not they should invest inside of this. It was interesting because I was at Lowe's and I was talking to the manager of the one store, and the ineffectiveness that they have currently on the processes they're doing to put in a customer order. They have internal sales, and inside the internal sales department, they're using a system that's pretty much an old-fashioned DOS-style implementation system. It can be viewed across platform, but it's a very ineffective, slow process which requires constant page back mechanisms in a waterfall tier system, but doesn't integrate across the board. If one person is making a sale in the kitchens and the kitchen is working to get sinks and baths, nothing integrates. Each piece has to be done separately for each client, and each sales orientation area has to make their own initial project scope and defining everything that they need for their clients to put it all together into one piece. Eternally, the manager was asking me what it would be to take his team together and make one platform and how they could do that. And we discussed measures, but it became back to his corporate values of where he would be separate from that and they won't allow him to do it. So this is one of the project areas of where I was discussing with a local person about project worth and trying to get him to explain, if not every stakeholder's on board, it becomes an ineffective project and not worth his time. And then we were discussing how he could alternately come around to speed effective measures up internally, just by simple process changes in the way the workforce actually work together. This planning and the processing is really one of the largest pieces I can't tell you guys to think about the most. The triple constraints are always there. We have the time, the scope, and the cost. Inside of that, the schedule of activities is one of the biggest things that people don't understand when they first get into project management. When I say activities or actions, and a lot of times you can think of this in a multiple level process. I always like to think about it in human capital assets. If we look at a human capital, a person, employee, let's say it's a coder, someone who's initiating the first piece of the agile process. We have to look at, one, the cost of that employee, the time that it will take for him to complete the scope of his portion before it can be passed along or integrated in with the other employees that are working on his team to produce this. These are part of the actions and part of the costs. It is also a measure of what effective tools he will need, whether it's upgrades in hardware, software, and we also have to think about the idea of faults. And when I say faults, I'm kind of introducing this now this week because I want you to start thinking about this in your plans, is what happens when something breaks down? What happens when that key person is down? Maybe he gets the flu or she gets the flu. Maybe there's a car crash. They're out of the workflow for a week. How do you estimate those into your costs? Is this something that you have to think about by adding a contractor cost or a third-party vendor and implementing those ideas into your plans right away? What happens if you're looking at a life cycle and a projection itself is already only a 2-year plan? How do you measure that? Is there ways? Yes. Is it an effective measure? First off, is one of the things you have to think about. Just because everybody thinks we have to instill a new hardware or software doesn't mean it's the best idea. This comes back into our business continuity idea that you guys will start reaching into a little bit here, because it's not just planning for now, the now project, but the continuation of this project afterwards with the closing of your clients, and more importantly, if something happens during this process, like we were saying, if there's a flu, if you lose a key person, what are you going to do? How can you pull? Can you change a person's role? Can you move them over into another situation? This is all part of selecting the best employees to do the best jobs and making sure that they have multiple talents a lot of times that'll help you, especially in small teams. You know, the executive process is really that coordinating of people into that bridge. These all kind of work together. A lot of times people don't understand the fact that you have to keep a constant quality assurance measure going. It should not be just at milestone agreements. A lot of project managers think that they should assess only at milestone agreements to make sure everything is on track, that the quality of each piece is happening, the scope is on, and the time is actually working and flowing together. I like to put in what I call firewalls, and if you're in a disaster recovery class with me, I talk about constant firewalls, and these are fire drills essentially, to where I constantly will have built in random area times, and I do it in workflow times when you're not expecting it. When everybody's about to go to lunch, I come in and say, power's out, we lost everything, who didn't back up, on a regular basis. I will look at and say, there was a lightning strike, we just went down, what do we do? Grab our continuity plans, what do we need to do, what are the actions, and make sure this is flowing inside of our process so we're not down for 2-3 days. And I also look at the measurements of communication control to make sure everything we have in place and who's reporting to who and everything is flowing correctly to make sure we get back on track on time. Yeah, this is a lot of processes that happened in, I love to say, Ford Motor Company, where they started that initial line process of building a vehicle. But they would do these tests as well. What happens if someone went out sick, or what happens if someone accidentally gets their arm caught in a piece of machinery? What do you have to do for those control measures and safety measures and to get business back and flowing? These are all part of that process. When we flow into the monitoring and controlling, if we do this continuously on the triple constraints, things flow a lot easier overall to the milestones. You know, they're more and less checkpoints that should be brought into perspective. A lot of times team leaders like to have the Monday and Friday meetings, they call them. And they will do reporting, and every single individual on the team has to report where they are and keep up a consistent flow so that stakeholders can then be updated, or the president, CIO, whoever you're actually reporting to. But these performance reportings are one of the most valuable assets inside of each process. They're a good way of controlling the flow, making sure everything's happening and on track, and a great indicator if something's going wrong. And you can look at your continuation plan at this point as well to keep it in check, to make sure that it's in a flow chart to where that if something does happen, it doesn't need revised itself. Changes can be made in these processes to help speed up or slow down, and it helps with that quality overall. One of the largest things that a lot of students don't understand because they don't have to do this is the actual closing processes of any of these projects. They're a real formal acceptance of the client, presentation. A lot of times they're being done by upper management and sales team. The presidents are there. But this is a pomp and circumstance a lot of times. But there's aspects inside of these closing contracts which we have to look at. The testing of making sure everything's done, the archiving of the process. But more importantly, I always bring into that idea the lessons learned. And we always do, in the teams that I've worked on, individual SWOT analysis from each other, and we share our values learned, and we integrate this into a master plan. We constantly update to see if we need to be able to change areas for the next process in this project we're working on. Now, this is good team measurements. It's actually looking at your own performance, the overall team success performance, and measuring systems. I think a lot of you have probably heard the measurement system by Six Sigma as one of the kind of predominant ways that a lot of people and teams will measure, and that's the original defining of the tasks and the constraints when you're looking back at it. Were you able to meet each one of these at your milestone? Was there any problems inside of the scope? Did you falsely, when you were looking at your actual charter, incorrectly project the amount of net value it's going to have? Was there some major rule that developed inside of this that you didn't think about and you had to add? Did you have to add a vendor? Was there a disaster such as the power going out to where you had to implement your disaster recovery plan and you found follies inside of that that need to be brought back into the mix before the next project started? Now, these are measuring those critical assumptions and looking at the critical assumptions you originally made in that project charter to make sure that they were actually correct. So if you bring these same assumptions into a next project that has similar ideas, you want to make sure that they're updated and not ineffective. And again, it's the analyzing for continual growth and profit of the organization overall. Looking at that investment value on this project that you just did and being honest. Did it have value? Was the value significant enough that it should continue? Or another investment in such a same type of project be taken on? Just because you take a government contract doesn't mean that it's always going to come out with a profit in the end. I saw this a lot of times working for the state of Pennsylvania, or Commonwealth of Pennsylvania rather, to where we would take on projects because the contracts said we had to, but we didn't make a profit. We would break even, or it had really no value. We were doing things to keep inside of a business model and to make sure we had continued growth for larger contracts hereafter. So you have to assess the value a lot of times of these smaller projects to see if they're worth catching the bigger fish, and ways to improve the actual follies that you had inside of these. Looking at that control really looks at the risk assessment, and that's part of those ideas of looking to see whether this was actually a project that's procuring great business investment and organizational advancement. During that process, did you have conflict negotiations with the contract itself? Did you have conflict negotiations internally? Did you have problems with human resources and personnel that you might be able to incorporate in your new business continuity plan to making sure these measures were taken into your assumptions that it could happen again? Was the scope verified correctly? Did the project quality meet the constraints of your stakeholders and your clients? Were the updates done on the correctly timed? Did you do tests? Were there firewalls in place that were effective? Were they not effective? Were they a waste of time? These are all things at Six Sigma that people look at. And it's back to that kind of that 5-point of project process to where we're actually thinking about taking on a project. Is it have an organizational need? If we went back and had the same contract, because a lot of times this is a repeat business, you do it year after year after year, should we take this project on next time? Are you looking at technology projects that are inside of this that had to be integrated? Were they necessary? Could you have done something else? Was there a way to flow this together more agile? Is there a present value? You have to look at that analysis of that actual net present value and see if it actually worked out in the end. Did you have a balanced scorecard? A lot of people like to use the weighted value scoring. I'll bring this up now, and I threw this in here because it is a valid method for actually looking back at the project you just did and others and weighting them if you want to take on the same contract, or contracts with other people or do the same tasks over and over? How many times is it worth the project coming back in your face instead of just investing in new computers instead of updating constantly? We have to look at all these little different levels, and weighting is a good way to measure that out, where you can actually put a value and weight on it, and then look at the top projects that you're working at or processes and decide which one you want to take on the most and cut the bottoms off. And again, this all comes back in your project charter, but in the end and the closing, it all needs to be reflected on again. When you guys are thinking about your closing and your final, you should be talking about this, looking back and reorganizing the actual value of the project itself. Did it have value? Did it bring value to the company? Is there other projects that we should bring into the mix? These are all asking questions that most young project managers don't want to bring into the mix, because you don't want to look like you had any faults. And in closings, you never want to report your faults. But that's the best way to learn, gaining from these faults, these actions that were not effective. So I just want to kind of take a step back and bring this a little bit more into perspective. I think it was slipping out of focus a little bit in the last week. And just kind of talk about the importance of that flow, and how when you're coming back over this idea in the closings, you're rehashing almost every single thing and every step you did, and evaluating every single assumption you made in the beginning and in the charters. Thanks, gangs, for listening. You guys are doing great work. I really appreciate it. A lot of you are bringing great analysis into this and reflection and the personal things you're doing. That's what I'm looking for you guys to do. Actually apply these stages and steps when you read and you understand about the different stages of different areas. Make sure you apply it to what you're doing in your lessons learned. Have a great week, everyone.